use the R word, the recovery word. And we
Yeah.
have people who have questions and feelings and emotions that come with this, and people are saying, what do you mean? Somebody's just flat out, you don't recover from autism. I'm trying to, Augusta George is watching too. So somebody said, you don't recover from autism. You can learn to help them live and work with it. And somebody else said, well, I just started watching when she said that 2 kids recovered, so I want to know what she meant. But I would agree with you with not recovering, but I just want to learn more about it and about helping your child. We know that words have so much meaning for people, that we attach meaning to words. And sometimes when people use the word recovery, people have emotions. So let's define what you mean by it. But I want to first ask everybody, I had to at a certain point, you got to open your mind to possibilities.
Right. So, and I have to say, Shannon, it also evokes a lot of emotion in me.
I bet.
Because my entire life has been dedicated to this field.
Yeah.
So let me just, I try very hard to not get defensive as well. So I'll do my best. Because there's one group of people that I absolutely have no right to disagree with. And those are the folks who have a diagnosis themselves and are in some way find that word offensive. I have absolutely no right to tell you how to feel by any means. And in fact, I apologize if there's anyone listening who is on the spectrum themselves and they find the word recovery somewhat insulting. I don't understand it, but I respect it completely because it's your world, it's your diagnosis. I have no right to make any comments about how you feel about a particular word that somewhat defines who you are. So I get that. That population aside, if you are a parent and you do not believe that an individual with autism has, not every individual, but that some individuals with autism have the ability to become absolutely 100% recovered, and I mean that. In other words, they have nothing different than any other child or an adult or individual, then I have issue with that. And I want to talk about that because if you haven't seen it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Now, I have, and I would recommend that the first thing you do is that you go, and I will define it, I'm happy to define it, and I will talk about it for as long as you guys want. But please don't imply that my entire life and the life of thousands of individuals who have worked in this field has been useless. If we didn't recover kids, there wouldn't be insurance funding for this right now. Let's just start there.
Yeah.
You don't get insurance funding for things that are just remedial. You get insurance funding for things that are classified as medical necessity, which means it's a life or death type thing. It means it's the difference in your child's outcome altogether. So this is no joke, and it's not a matter of my opinion either. Back in the 70s and 80s, when we used to do therapy, recovery was published in 1987. The first article that published recovery defined it, and that study, I will go back and talk about, was a study that came out of UCLA where I was on that project. And basically what it was, and this was published in 1987, the studies showed that we had 3 groups of children. The first group received 40 hours of one-to-one ABA therapy from us at UCLA in the project that was called the Autism Project. The second group received 10 hours of the same therapy from us again. The reason they received 10 hours was because they lived too far away from UCLA and we could not access them on a regular basis. They were very far. They were like an hour drive. And our therapists at UCLA couldn't go out there that often. Okay, so they received 10 hours a week. The ones that were closer received 40 hours a week. And then there was a third group which received 10 hours a week of a different type of therapy from the other side of UCLA, which is now called Semel Institute. Back then was called Neuropsychiatric Institute. And that was sort of a different, kind of an eclectic approach. After 2.5 years, the result was that 47%, half of the kids in our intensive group had recovered, as opposed to 2% in the other 2 groups who received 10 hours of therapy. Now, what is recovered back then? How did we define it? The way we defined it, it was 3 different criteria. One was that there was a normal IQ. So these individuals were tested on intelligence tests. We tested them before beginning intervention and then after 2.5 years to 3 years of intervention. And their IQ was normal. Normal means it was around 100 points. What else did we do? We also placed them in regular education first grade, and they were there in regular ed without any assistance. And this is, we're talking back in the 80s, okay? So that was the second criteria. The third criteria was a independent psychiatrist would remove the individuals, like would see the individual and say, no, this person doesn't classify for autism. Okay, that is how we defined it back then. Now, how do we define it now? Like, so many years have gone by and we've learned a lot more about autism, and we've seen different gradients of autism too, by the way. So the way that I define it, and the way that we have now published on it multiple times, by the way, we've now also published on, we had a publication that looked at 34 of our kids, I believe, and we went back and we checked not only their IQ, but also adaptive testing. So that's called the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale, VABS. These are all standardized measures, by the way. These are not measures that we've just made up and said, oh, they work for us. This is how any child would be tested. So the adaptive measure looks at things like daily living, socialization, communication, etc. And all of these children get to the level of normal. Normal, which means they are indistinguishable from their peers. Indistinguishable from peers. That's a very important term. So now when we call someone recovered, we look at IQ, adaptive functioning, social functioning, and language functioning. Those 4 things, as well as I even go above and beyond, and I test my kids on executive functioning and pragmatic language. We give a series of tests at the very, very end where we look at every area, and we want to make sure that the kids are really, really doing well in school. They have friends, they're doing fine. So yes, there are those individuals who still have signs and symptoms of autism. Those are not the individuals that we are classifying as recovered fully. Yes, there are individuals who will even lose their diagnosis. They no longer fit the criteria for ASD. You could say, for all practical purposes, those individuals are recovered because they no longer classify for a diagnosis. If they went and saw a doctor today, the doctor would not give them the diagnosis of autism. So for all practical purposes, those individuals are recovered. But at CARD, for research purposes, we go above that. We go above that criteria. And we do a ton of testing to prove that this individual fits right in the middle of peers, or in many cases, higher than their peers, because a lot of our kids have incredible memory and unbelievable skills. They don't lose those skills. They're just gaining, learning other things they need so that they can function in normal society. Many of these individuals not only go on to school, but they go to college. I've been around in the field long enough where I have individuals who've been married. I'm waiting for my first married couple to actually have children so we can see how that goes. But what I'm saying is that it is absolutely possible for individuals to do extremely well. Now, not every individual, and we don't know why. To be honest with you, we will start with, and the younger the child is, as Shannon said, the more hours they get. We've also shown these things. It's a matter, this is how I see autism, and can I keep ranting?
You can.
Sorry about
You're taking us to church. No, people are liking that. We have people from northern India saying more on recovery, and
I just don't
people
want,
are thrilled to hear.
I don't want people, you know, many years ago, you guys, this is one thing about being in this field for 40 years. I will never forget, I was probably in my late 20s. I had finished my doctorate, I was licensed, I had just opened CARD. And I remember testifying, maybe I was like early 30s, I don't remember. I remember testifying because we were trying to get funding for people back then. I remember testifying in court for a family here in California. And the judge, this is where I've come from. And this is why I get so upset with people doubting the fact that there's a lot of potential for people on the spectrum to recover. And I want to talk about that because there's nothing wrong with having ASD other than the fact that it makes it harder for you to integrate and benefit from what society has to offer. That's all. Just as if you had hearing impairment. There's nothing wrong with it. No one's boo-hooing it or saying anything bad about it, but it is definitely harder for an individual who's hearing impaired to use what's around them in society because they need modifications. It is difficult for someone who's blind. It is difficult for someone who has to use a crutch. Everything makes it more easy if you are able to integrate in society, if you're able to benefit from normal education, if you're benefiting from having friends. All of those things, I think personally, are beneficial to you. So why not allow us to teach the individual as much as we possibly can? How does autism, to me, this is how autism is. So first of all, to begin with, I mean, I formed my own theories of where autism comes from. But from my perspective, autism is a diagnosis that has to do with the inability to detoxify fast enough from all these environmental toxins that we experience. These affect the child's developing brain in different ways. Some children will have very severe effects based on the developmental period. Let's say the child is very, very early on and they're not able, they have high toxicity due to exposure to various things, which we can't even measure. There's no way we can measure all the toxicity in our environment. There's too many types of toxicity, and we also don't know the genetic composition that leads to this low redox. So it's a combination of being unable to detoxify and being exposed to all these toxins, leading to the differences in how we learn. You know, I was just reading again last night another study that came out on sensory sensitivities. To me, this is really about the sensory input, because if you look at a child, a young child, how do they learn? They learn by the things they see and hear and sense and so on. This is how we all learn, right? There's so much we have not yet learned, and we're beginning to now learn about how individuals with autism see things. I mean, Temple Grandin tells us this from years and years ago when she was a child, that she used to see things in individual boxes, right? We now know through studies that individuals with autism actually, when they see a scene, they're seeing certain things that we're not seeing, and they're not seeing other things that we're seeing.
Right.
And you know what? I guarantee you there's differences amongst us similarly. We just don't know it.
Yeah.
Because we are within the similar realm. So if I look at something like right now, I'm looking in that direction, of course the first thing I see is the camera. But at the same time, without even diverting my eyes, I see you, Shannon, I see the screen, I see all the things in the room. Individuals with autism don't have those same exact capabilities. They see other things. Like when they're looking at the camera, they'll see the logo on the bottom of the camera where I wouldn't necessarily. And so because of the fact that they perceive things sensory through their senses differently, because of how their brain was developing early on, they learn differently. It is just as simple as that. They learn differently. Now, when they learn differently, sometimes it is so far from what the environment has allowed us. Like, just as an example, if I'm auditorily, it's the same thing. They have different sensitivities and selectivity. So auditory, let's assume I hear sounds more than I hear language. One of my own kids said this to me. Andy said this to me, one of my recovered kids. He said to me, I used to hear background noises like the door screeching much more prevalent than the sounds of language. If that's the case, you're never going to learn language. You are going, because language is a background noise. Yeah. You're going to learn to block language. So their sensory input is different. If we're receiving information visually and auditorily in different ways, we're not going to learn the same way. What does ABA do? ABA adjusts that. That's all it does. ABA sits with the child and allows the child to learn through different modalities. It gives the child the ability to pay attention now to all the different things in the room instead of the logo. It gives the child practice at a very early age to listen to the sound of language as opposed to those background sounds. So ABA corrects or redirects the learning of the child and intensifies it, because a lot of our children, you start at 3, I'm happy. If you start at 2, I'm even happier, because the child's learning has gone awry. The child is learning things like that little logo, like that background noise, and the sooner I get them, the more I can teach them.
Yeah.
Now, if I have a 3-year-old, I have 2 years, 3 years where I can teach the child everything they need to reach the normal functioning of a 5 or 6-year-old. I will do my best to do that. And that involves lots and lots and lots of hours of therapy, but it also involves the parent making sure the child is sleeping, making sure the child is not eating anything they're allergic to, making sure the child doesn't have massive gastrointestinal issues and pain. Because the more comfortable the child is, the more ready they are for learning, the more they're sleeping, the more healthy they are, the more they will take in. And the more they take in, if we all work as a team, the individual is taking in all this stuff. There's no question in my mind that individuals with autism can learn. That's the key to it. How much can they learn? It just has to do with how much practice. If someone comes to you today, to me, and says, hey, at your age, can you learn Chinese? I'll say, oh my God, it doesn't sound like it's ever possible. But you know what? It is possible. It's just a matter of how much time and effort I put into it.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. So I'll take a deep breath.
I appreciate it, because we see the passion that you have for the subject and how much you love our kids. I just want to say, as a parent, that, you know, so often when we're at like a walk or something like that, a parent will bring up a child and say, can you, at one of the last walks we went to, a dad said, can you explain to my daughter who's 10 what autism is in her little brother? And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. you know, rolling up the sleeves, like, how am I going to explain this to a 10-year-old? And what I said to her was, you know computers, right? And she said, yes. And I said, okay, there are some computers that are Macs and there are some computers that are PCs, right? And she said, yeah. And I said, which one do you like better? And she said, well, I like this on this and this on this. I said, okay, there are brains that are Macs and there are brains that are PCs. But if all you ever did was teach a Mac PC language, it wouldn't get very far.
That's really good.
You wouldn't get very far.
Right.
So, you know, right now, but Macs are great.
Yep.
And Macs can do things that PCs can't do.
That's right.
Nobody's saying that it isn't bad. But if all you ever teach a Mac is PC, and I said, your brother's a Mac.
Right.
And right now, he's speaking a different language. His brain is speaking a different language. So he's getting therapy, and he's going to learn how to translate the languages. It's not going to change the fact that he's a Mac, right? But he is not going to be held back by the fact that you speak a different language.
Absolutely. I mean, Shannon, I experience this a lot of times myself when I'm learning different languages, right? When I was learning German, I remember that, like, in the beginning, I would be in Germany and people are talking and I'd be like, okay, I got that word, I got that one, but this is way too hard. I'm just going to do my own thing. And I'd find myself becoming more and more isolated, not isolated because I'd be going out with my husband and his family, but it was more about, like, I just would kind of, like, my brain would start floating to other topics because I couldn't understand what's going on around me. As time passed and as I learned more and more single words, even to this day, when I go back, I completely understand everything now. And I never even took a single class in German at all. It was just a matter of practice and exposure, and I could pick it up. An opportunity. And I know it's the same thing because I went through, it's the same exact thing as learning languages. And as you said, you know, the Mac PC thing is the same exact thing. We, as kids, our kids are amazing. Sometimes I'll see children who are like 5 years old, and they're still the sweetest human being ever. They have no aggression, yet they can't communicate at all. And I think to myself, oh my dear Lord, how is this little guy not getting aggressive? How is this guy not getting ticked off because no one understands him? And I always tell the parents, it's because of you. The parent has been amazing as figuring out what his needs are. And you know what? You need to stop. Like, this is the very interesting thing. I think you may have said this to me, or a mom said this to me and said, do you realize that when they're babies, right? we have to figure out with our babies why they're crying. Is it a cry because they need a diaper change, or they're hungry, or they're angry or hurt, right? What's going on?
Yeah.
So we figure that out. With kids with autism, we never stop that.
Yeah.
And with normal typically developing kids, at some point we're like, you're 2 years old, you need to use your words,
Yes.
you know, and we don't do that with our kids. The reason I get so passionate about this subject of recovery is that personally I feel that if I don't set a high enough bar, I am not doing what I'm meant to be doing. I am accepting less than the child that I'm working with can produce. And then I'll be no different from everyone else who's just babysitting. And that's not what my world is about, nor is it what anyone at CARD is supposed to be doing, because our goal is not to maintain the kids where they are. Our goal is to teach them. And whether we can teach them one new subject or content or 1,000, we have to push. We have to push higher and higher, because otherwise we're just accepting, and the child will not go beyond the limit we set for them. As far as I'm concerned, individuals with autism have no limits. There is no upper limit. I want to push them for the rest of their lives to be happy, to do the best they can. And it's not really about recovery or not recovery. It's just about that limit. It's about never expecting the child to do anything less than I would expect anyone else to do.
I think too, and one of our colleagues has asked me to do more on the show about recovery, and I expressed to him, I said, you know I want to, but it always ends up in a discussion because it's a very volatile word for people.
It is.
But I do think that, and I'm just going to apologize and say we're going to do, for not having done this before, I'm going to apologize. We have to show more of it, because just like when your husband is still talking about having met these people, and to say, oh my gosh, he lives with you and knows what you do and sees everybody, but when you see it and you can see where it came from, I think in the beginning people go, oh, even people who've been around it for a while, they go, oh, I didn't know that was possible.
That's right.
We started at CARD, we had heard what was possible, and then about we had been having therapy for 4 years, and I introduced my husband to an adult who had recovered, and we had a whole conversation with him, and then afterwards we walked away, and I said, wasn't that amazing? Don't you feel like that's so incredible? And he said, it was a great conversation. What are you getting so excited about? And I said, you understand who that was that you just talked to. You understand that he was a kiddo on the spectrum. He's one of the recovered kids. And my husband clutched his chest.
And said, oh my God.
And said, are you, the guy I was just talking to that we were talking about, are you talking about that guy? That guy is a recovered kid. That guy and my husband was overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And he said, oh my gosh, Shannon, you see this all the time. That's the first time I've ever seen it. I need to be showing you more of that. So that's what I'm going to do.
And honestly, for our viewers, please go on Amazon and order Recovered Journeys Through Autism. I made that film because it was for parents who went through this exactly the thing that you guys are going through. These are parents who were at very high level university settings getting their kids diagnosed and were told, put your child in special ed, just save your money, you're gonna need it later on. Your child's never gonna recover. This is not something that you recover from, all that sort of stuff. And we're talking, you guys, back, 90s, early 90s. And they didn't believe it, and they put all their efforts into it. And you will see these children when they started, and you will see these children at age 13, whatever, 11, 17, when they're done. And I wish, I don't have time right now, but one of my dreams is to do a follow-up on those kids, because the child who on there is, to me, looks the most severe is, I can't even tell you what he's doing right now in the world, because it's so high level. And he's, all four of those kids are doing incredibly well in their worlds. One of them is lecturing across the world about various things. They are more than recovered.
Not about autism. I want to point out he's not lecturing about autism.
No,
he's lecturing about scientific
He's talking about
techniques.
science.